The sound of silence was heavy that morning in Burkina Faso. 60 coffins, each draped in the national flag, lined the courtyard under the scorching African sun. Mothers clutched photographs, fathers stood motionless, and young children asked questions no one dared to answer. They were not just soldiers. As President Ibrahim Traoré whispered in grief, they were the nation's voices, and someone tried to silence them. The attack had come at 4:38 a.m., precise and merciless. Communications were severed in less than 2 minutes. Drones monitoring the frontier mysteriously went offline. By sunrise, 60 of the country's bravest sons had been cut down. Was this tragedy mere coincidence, or was it punishment for defiance? Only 4 days earlier, President Traoré had rejected the smiling handshakes and glittering medals offered by Western envoys. He had refused their promises, their theater of diplomacy, and now 60 men were gone. Across Ouagadougou, the capital life came to a standstill. Government buildings carried banners of mourning, schools closed. On television screens, portraits of the fallen replaced entertainment names, ages, hometowns. The youngest was only 19, the oldest 38. Most were fathers, all were sons of the land. Yet alongside the mourning, doubt grew louder. Who benefits when Burkina Faso bleeds? Who still holds the trigger when a nation dares to stand tall? This is not only the story of 60 flag-draped coffins. It is about whether a small African nation has the right to defend itself without asking permission. It is about whether a continent long silenced can now reclaim its voice. So I ask you, if your leader turned grief into strategy, if he refused to kneel and instead armed his people with dignity, would you follow him to the end? Please share where you are watching from in the comments. And if you believe President Ibrahim Traoré represents the spirit of a new Africa, one that will never kneel again, subscribe now and stand with us. It was not the dead of night, but the first fragile light of dawn when the attack began. At exactly 4:38 a.m., the eastern military outpost near Dargo, a tactical corridor where Burkina Faso had quietly strengthened its patrols, was engulfed in chaos. Within the first 2 minutes, every channel of communication went dark. The distress signals never reached command. Surveillance drones circling overhead went offline as if someone had flipped a hidden switch, and then silence followed by the thunder of coordinated fire. By the time reinforcements arrived, it was too late. 60 soldiers lay fallen, their posts reduced to blackened wreckage. Each man was later carried home beneath a flag, not just as soldiers, but as sons of the soil, fathers, brothers, and husbands whose lives ended in unison under a sky that offered no warning. The bodies were retrieved by noon and brought back to Ouagadougou. What followed was a scene that even the most stoic could not endure. Government buildings lowered their banners. Black drapes hung across ministries. On the steps of the National Assembly, a long, unbroken banner stretched across the stone. They did not die in vain. Nationwide mourning was declared for 3 days. Schools across all 13 regions were closed. On national television, there was no music, no laughter, only the somber display of portraits, names, and hometowns of the fallen. The youngest was just 19, a boy who had barely tasted adulthood. The eldest was 38, a father of 3 who left behind children, now asking why their father will never return. In mosques and churches, the prayers carried the same refrain: "May their sacrifice awaken us." In Bobo Dioulasso, the Grand Mosque overflowed with mourners, their voices breaking as the imam spoke of courage and betrayal. Outside in the courtyard, conversations grew sharper. "So this is the cost," one man said, gesturing toward the radio report. "This is the price we pay for standing straight." Around him, no one answered, but the silence spoke louder than words. At the University of Ouagadougou, the grief of the young turned into defiance. Students painted new slogans across campus walls. "Our dignity has a price, and we are paying it." Their spray paint dripped under the afternoon sun, not as vandalism, but as testimony, a reminder that memory can be written not only in books, but in concrete. Even the media, often careful with its language, began to shift. State outlets used terms like strategic retaliation and coordinated message. One bold headline in the La Faso Tribune: "Cut through the fog of grief, refuse the West." And they remind you who still holds the trigger. For a nation long accustomed to being overlooked, the brutality of the attack had become impossible to frame as chance. The timing was too precise, the silence of the skies too engineered. The refusal of President Ibrahim Traoré to accept a US-led award delegation only days earlier had left its mark. And now, 60 flag-draped coffins seemed like the price of defiance. Through it all, the president himself remained silent. No accusations, no dramatic speeches. He walked slowly past the rows of coffins, his face etched not in rage but in resolve. In the stillness of the presidential compound, his closest advisors described an atmosphere not of despair but of controlled fire. The people saw only silence, but behind closed doors, documents were being drafted, chains of command redrawn, and orders quietly signed. But in the streets, the silence felt unbearable. Market women, teachers, farmers all whispered the same question: was this just bad timing, or was it sabotage? And deeper still, who benefits from Burkina Faso's pain? The nation was grieving, yes. But beneath the mourning, something else stirred an awakening that this attack was not just against soldiers, but against sovereignty itself. The mourning was still raw when the whispers began to take form. Only 4 days before the attack, President Ibrahim Traoré had stood face-to-face with Western envoys. They had arrived in Ouagadougou carrying polished medals, scripted handshakes, and a promise of strategic cooperation. But Traoré had refused them all. No awards, no photo ceremonies, no deals disguised as friendship. He closed the door in their faces, and now 60 men were dead. In the capital's cafes and mosques, the conversation was no longer about grief, but consequence. "You see," said one elder outside the Grand Mosque, "this is the cost of standing tall." At the University of Ouagadougou, students sprayed new slogans: "Our dignity has a price, and we're paying it." Each word was painted with urgency dripping down the walls as though written in blood. The media, too, shifted its tone. State outlets spoke openly of strategic retaliation. Newspapers ran bold headlines: "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still holds the trigger." For many citizens, the idea that this was merely coincidence had evaporated. Too much aligned: the timing, the precision, the silence of drones gone offline at the very moment of attack. Suspicion hardened into certainty. Yet Traoré himself remained quiet. He did not call press conferences, nor did he point fingers. Instead, behind the high walls of the Koulouba presidential complex, something else was unfolding. His advisors described it as a fire carefully contained, burning hotter with each passing hour. Drafts of new defense protocols appeared on his desk. Chains of command were redrawn. Logistics officers received sealed orders to relocate drone fabrication equipment to the eastern frontier. When the president finally spoke, it was not in anger, but in command. "We are not here to bury heroes. We are here to protect the living." That very evening, under heavy escort, Traoré walked into an abandoned industrial facility on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Once a vehicle maintenance hub during the Sankara era, its rusting beams and flickering lights had long stood silent. Now Traoré ran his hand across the steel and told the engineers waiting inside, "We build here, we build now, and we build with our own." Within 3 days, the first shipment of composite shells for unmanned aerial vehicles arrived. No foreign imports, no outside experts, just Burkinabé engineers, soldiers, and students assembling a new kind of defense with nothing but resourcefulness and will. Traoré signed the first directive of its kind, a fully state-funded drone program operated exclusively by Burkinabé scientists and technicians. But Burkina Faso was not alone for long. 48 hours after the attack, a gray unmarked aircraft landed quietly at Bobo Dioulasso airstrip. From its ramp descended 11 men in black tactical uniforms, Russian special operations instructors. They did not arrive with speeches or conditions. They came to train. Traoré's orders had been firm. They come on our terms or they do not come at all. In joint drills, Burkinabé elite units trained alongside Russian operatives on urban counterstrikes, drone interceptions, and remote border warfare. Instruction manuals were translated into French overnight. Yet command remained entirely Burkinabé. No private mercenaries, no foreign flags flying over local bases. Strategic cooperation, yes. Dependency, never. The West noticed. In Paris and Washington, think tanks hurried to publish memos titled "Russia's Advance in the Sahel." Embassies issued polite but tense condolences, even as whispers of sanctions began. Foreign journalists shifted their language. Yesterday, they had called Traoré young and daring. Today, they called him reckless and dangerous. But inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was entirely different. Markets buzzed with a strange new energy. Farmers, teachers, students, even griots began to say the same thing: "We will not be caught unready again." Then President Traoré unveiled the true scope of his response Operation Kulpulgo. Its mandate stretched far beyond traditional defense. Every region of the country was to establish decentralized response units. Teachers became trainers. Farmers learned reconnaissance. Students coded algorithms for thermal drones. Community halls turned into readiness centers. It was not revenge, it was resilience built into the very fabric of daily life. For many outside observers, it seemed as if a small African nation was overreaching. But for those inside Burkina Faso, it felt like the beginning of something larger. As one retired colonel remarked while reviewing the new training curriculum, this is not about revenge. This is about memory turning it into muscle. And in that transformation from grief to strategy, from silence to mobilization, the people saw not defeat but defiance. The shock of 60 flag-draped coffins did not fade into silence. It reshaped the country itself. From the dust of grief rose an entirely new doctrine, one that touched not only soldiers, but every corner of Burkinabé life. Within days, the Ministry of National Security announced a radical restructuring. Recruitment was no longer based solely on physical strength. Every new candidate had to demonstrate multi-skill adaptability, surveillance communications, even code literacy. Supply routes were redrawn. Red zones were digitally mapped. Bureaucratic delays, once a constant frustration, were bypassed as direct funding reached regional units. For the first time, every province had both the mandate and the resources to defend itself. But the transformation did not stop at the barracks. Operation Kulpulgo spread into schools, farms, and community halls. In Toma, carpenters converted their guild hall into a training ground where wooden models were used to simulate drone parts. In Jibo University, students studying software engineering began writing algorithms for thermal detection. In Feta, retired hunters taught teenagers how to read terrain in darkness. Suddenly, national defense was no longer the business of generals, it became the shared responsibility of an entire people. Even culture became weaponized, not for violence, but for memory. In Batia, musicians turned protest lyrics into songs of resilience that echoed through market stalls. In Tikare, dancers choreographed performances using military formations, art blended with discipline, grief transformed into choreography. Griots, the traditional keepers of oral history, began composing verses that retold the ambush as a turning point. When the nation bled, the cowards ran. But the brave picked up songs and turned them into spears. Across the country, 60 freedom trees were planted, one for each fallen soldier. Each tree carried a plaque engraved with a name, a birthplace, and the words, "You fell, so we may rise." In classrooms, children watered those trees before beginning their lessons, a daily ritual that connected education with remembrance. The political consequences were equally profound. Traoré's cabinet moved swiftly to shield the economy from external retaliation. Within a week, the Ministry of Finance circulated a confidential roadmap for fiscal delinking. Foreign currency reserves were discreetly relocated. Trade dependencies were reassessed. Chinese negotiators were quietly approached to provide interim liquidity guarantees, ensuring that Burkina Faso could withstand the financial isolation already hinted at by Western partners. When sanctions arrived, frozen visas delayed infrastructure funding. The withdrawal of foreign consultants, the government responded not with panic, but with recalibration. Every canceled contract was placed under review. Highways, hydroelectric stations, and mining concessions were audited. If they were found exploitative, they would be reclaimed under state control. Traoré put it plainly, better to be accused of nationalism than to be accused of submission. Meanwhile, the shockwaves of the attack rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within 2 weeks, leaders from Mali and Niger joined Traoré in an undisclosed location near the Sahelian frontier. The summit's outcome was announced with clarity: the creation of a Sahelian wall of resistance. 3 flags stood side by side, representing a doctrine of mutual defense and collective sovereignty. The press release was unapologetic: "We are not forming a bloc of defiance. We are forming a union of clarity." Inside Burkina Faso, ordinary people felt this clarity in tangible ways. Farmers in Kaya volunteered as border scouts. Teachers in Manga introduced civic defense theory into their curriculum. Even grandmothers sewed camouflage patterns into ceremonial robes, declaring, "If our children fight, our culture fights with them." This was not simply a military response, it was a national metamorphosis. A country that once mourned, now prepared, embedding resilience into its schools, markets, villages, and faith communities. Out of tragedy, Burkina Faso had redrawn the meaning of sovereignty, no longer a policy in government halls, but a practice in the lives of its people. From Washington to Paris, the news from Ouagadougou was received with unease. What began as condolences quickly shifted into concern. Western diplomats issued statements of sympathy, but behind closed doors, their tone hardened. Policy memos circulated in Washington think tanks under titles like Russia's advance in the Sahel and Burkina Faso drifting toward extremism. In Paris, newspapers warned of instability and the loss of French influence in a region it once considered its backyard. Sanctions soon followed. Infrastructure funding was frozen. Visas were revoked. Development consultants quietly packed their bags and left. The message was clear: Burkina Faso's defiance would not go unpunished. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was not despair but defiance. As one shopkeeper told a local radio station, "They think we will kneel for rice and loans. They don't understand we have already chosen dignity over dependency." For the United States, the event stirred uncomfortable echoes of history. Commentators began drawing parallels to the early years of the Cold War, when small nations dared to assert independence and quickly found themselves caught between superpowers. But this time, the dynamic was different. Burkina Faso did not beg Moscow for salvation, nor did it surrender its command structure to Russian operatives. Instead, it defined the terms of cooperation itself, a sharp contrast to the dependency model that Washington had come to expect. The Pentagon flagged Burkina Faso for weekly intelligence updates, particularly monitoring its new drone program and the arrival of Russian instructors. Analysts debated whether Traoré's African Doctrine of Retaliation could inspire a wider movement across the continent. Would Mali, Niger, and perhaps even Chad follow? What if the Sahel became a zone of true sovereignty, no longer managed by foreign bases or IMF packages? For Western strategists, that was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Yet for many ordinary Americans, especially those old enough to remember their own country's fight for independence, the story struck a different chord. A small nation punished for rejecting foreign control was choosing to stand on its own 2 feet. The language Traoré used, "If we wait for permission to defend ourselves, we've already surrendered," could just as easily have been spoken in Philadelphia in 1776. Across Africa, the symbolism was powerful. Leaders in Mali and Niger openly embraced the Sahelian wall of resistance. Civil society groups in Ghana and Nigeria debated whether the time had come to loosen the grip of Western aid. Even beyond the continent, voices in Latin America and the Caribbean pointed to Burkina Faso as proof that sovereignty was still possible in a world dominated by giants. For the West, the question was whether to escalate pressure or adapt to a new reality. For Africa, the question was whether this moment of defiance could become a continental awakening. And for the American audience watching from afar, perhaps the deeper question is this: when a people refuse to bow, are they reckless, or are they simply remembering what freedom truly costs? What began as 60 flag-draped coffins has now become something far greater than a tragedy. It has become a doctrine. From Dargo to Ouagadougou, from classrooms to marketplaces, Burkina Faso transformed its grief into resolve. President Ibrahim Traoré did not answer with tears or empty speeches. He answered with strategy, with preparation, with a vision that refused to ask permission. But the world beyond Burkina Faso has not stayed silent. Sanctions are tightening. Western commentators whisper of instability, painting Traoré as reckless. Aid is being withheld, contracts frozen, consultants withdrawn. This is the familiar playbook of punishment. Yet here lies the danger. What if the old tools no longer work? What if, instead of bending, Burkina Faso and its allies only grow stronger in their resistance? For Africa, this moment is more than national defense. It is continental self-discovery. The Sahelian wall of resistance is no longer just an alliance of 3 states. It is a symbol. It asks a question every African must face: will we remain dependent on those who exploit us, or will we endure the price of sovereignty? And beyond Africa, this question echoes. In Latin America, in Asia, in the Caribbean, small nations are watching closely, wondering if they too can stand without bowing. And for you watching this from America, perhaps in your 60s or 70s, this moment carries a familiar rhythm. It recalls 1776, when your own ancestors stood against an empire accused of recklessness, branded as rebels, punished with sanctions and blockades. Yet they pressed on because freedom had no other substitute. Now Africa walks that same road. Do you see it as dangerous or as necessary? Burkina Faso's fallen soldiers are no longer only sons of their homeland. They have become seeds of a wider awakening. 60 freedom trees planted across 13 regions remind every child that sovereignty is not given, it is defended. Every drone built in secret hangars, every classroom turned into a training ground, every grandmother sewing camouflage into robes tells the world Africa will not kneel again. But the battle is not over. The question now is whether the wave will spread or whether it will be crushed before it rises. Will Mali, Niger, Chad, and others join in building a doctrine of true independence? Will the continent learn that waiting for permission is surrender in disguise? I leave you with this. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective, yet can we continue to trust him to carry this vision, or should Africa prepare for another leader to follow in his steps? Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Because 60 coffins may have been laid to rest, but the voices they carried are now marching through every street, every classroom, and every heart that refuses to bow.